And something that I did that I found super helpful for the HSE and for all of my modules is I had a list of what I would call context sentences. But I guess my process for formulating these essays and preparing for questions is that,
How many hours were you studying when it was those 2-3 weeks before the HSE?
to be completely honest, I did a couple of like 12-hour study days.
And what was your process for getting them right? Why was it taking you a day to do one practice question? What's up everyone, it's Johnny from Jettle here, and today I'm joined by Rosie, who just did incredibly well in her HSC. She came ninth in the state for English Advanced. Basically got all band sixes across all the humanities, huge ATAR, 98.25, and you got into a combined law degree at UNSW. So very impressive stats, very keen to unpack some of your insights and takeaways from the year so that you can help other students who are going through the HSC or maybe even years before that. But Rosie, thanks very much for being here. How's it feel to be all done with year 12?
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's so good being finished. Honestly, it's been such a nice break after doing the HSE.
It's probably one of the best feelings when you're done with that final exam. Were you expecting to have done so well with English Advanced?
Honestly, not at all. Like, it wasn't even on my radar to even think about getting a state rank. So it was like a really like pleasant surprise to have gotten that. Yeah.
In terms of like overall approach and expectations, did you go in with a specific goal when you were preparing for year 12? Did you have a particular ATAR or a particular mark or a degree that you wanted to do?
Yeah, so I think my main goal was to be able to get into law at UNSW. Once I decided I really wanted to commit to doing that about halfway through year 12. So I knew that required an ATAR in the high 90s. But in terms of all my specific subjects, throughout the year, I honestly just wanted to do the best that I could. So for each assessment that would come, I would just tell myself to just do my best, and I wouldn't worry too much about rank either. I would just try to do the best I could. And then by the time of the HSE, I was kind of expecting around what I needed to get into my course. I was able to just go into the HSE and just have one final push at doing the best I very could. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious to see how you actually approached all of the exams and assessments throughout year 12, given how well you did. I mean, you got final mark of 98 in the HSC exam, and we were saying just before this, 18 out of 20 in section 1. So you actually got full marks in all of the essays and module C in that final exam. So let's break down how you actually approached each of those parts. But maybe just before that, everyone's always curious as to how much you actually had to work at English or how much you studied for the HSE. So let's break down some of those numbers. How many hours were you studying when it was those 2-3 weeks before the HSE?
Well, right before the HSC and trials, to be completely honest, I did a couple of like 12-hour study days. So I was really doing the absolute most that I could. But during a school week where it would be quite busy, so just before exams or when it was a busy assessment period, in a typical week, I would usually have work Monday, Tuesday afternoons. So I really just had Wednesday and Thursday afternoons to do most of my studies, because Fridays I would have youth group and then usually hang out with friends before that. So usually I didn't get too much work done there. So on a typical school day, I'd usually have 1 to 2 hours during the actual school day due to study sessions. And then sometimes during the week as well, I'd wake up at maybe 5, 6 a.m., get a couple hours done before school. And then in the weekend on Saturday, I would usually have a pretty big study day, maybe 4 to 6 hours at least, in those busy times. I'd still try to, do things with my friends and with my family. So maybe go out for dinner with my family and go out for a coffee with friends in the morning, but I would really try to get as much study that I could do on Saturdays. And Sundays I would usually have a bit more of a slow day because I'd have church at night and then sometimes church in the morning as well, doing kids church. So in between, sometimes I do maybe 4 hours if I could, maximum. So pretty hectic weeks, honestly. Just trying to cram in as many hours as I could where I could.
And in terms of those bigger study days, like when you're doing those 12-hour grinds in the lead up to the HSC, how did you structure those days? How many subjects were you doing, and was there a particular order that you would study the subjects in?
Yeah, so maths was definitely the subject I struggled with the most throughout the entire year, and it was definitely the hardest subject to actually get myself to be motivated to do. So I would always try to start with math. On a school day, get up at 6 a.m. It would always be to do maths before school. And then also on those longer study days, I'd usually try to start with maths, get it out of the way so that I could focus on other subjects. And usually in one long study day, I didn't try to squeeze in all my subjects. I would usually focus on one, maybe two, because when I wrote practice essays, I could never just sit down and write one in an hour. It would always take me like at least a full day to produce one practice essay, because I was quite a bit of a perfectionist maybe when it came to writing essays. So it did take me a while. So yeah, usually only 1 to 2 subjects in a day maximum. I try to start pretty early in the morning just because I'm quite a morning person and I feel like I work best in the mornings, and then just maybe stop for lunch and occasional breaks to take a meal or something.
Yeah, nice. And where were you predominantly studying in that period as well? Were you like a library person, or were you always, locked in your room with no distractions?
Yeah, it honestly changed around a bit, which was actually really good to sort of switch up my study space. I definitely do work best alone because I get so distracted when I'm studying with my friends. But occasionally I would go to the uni library. Heaps of my friends would always be there studying. So there were always people to sort of study with. But even when I went there, I would usually just sit by myself because I know that if I sit with other people, I'm probably just gonna chat. So yeah.
That makes sense. I was pretty similar, and I think it also resonates in terms of what you're saying about the perfectionism, and it can take a full day when you're kind of looking at those drafts, and that can be a blessing and a curse, of course, because sometimes it just becomes inefficient, and you're hung up over one sentence that you're trying to get right when that those 4 hours could be spent covering a lot of the main content points on another subject. So it's always a tricky balance, but it sounds like you got it right at the end of the day. In terms of those English essays and those English modules, when you were preparing for those and doing a whole day on a practice draft, what did that look like for you? And maybe we start off with, how long were your essays? People always ask, well, how many words should your essay be? How many words were your essays? So length of the essays, and then what was your process for kind of getting them right? Why was it taking you a day to do one practice question? Hey everyone, it's Johnny from Jettle, and if you want to check out state rank examples, band 6 analysis, step-by-step guides to constructing the perfect essays, craft of writing pieces, whatever it is that you need for your English exams, then go to jettle.com. We've put everything in one place for you so that you don't need to look any further to get everything you need to succeed in your exams. And if you want to submit a draft and get expert marking, or you want to use our marking tools to get specific suggestions on how you can improve your essays, your creative writing pieces, anytime, anywhere, make sure you sign up to Jedi. It's less than $10 per week. People always ask, well, how many words should your essay be? How many words were your essays? So length of the essays, and then what was your process for kind of getting them right? Why was it taking you a day to do one practice question?
Yeah, so starting with length of the essays, each module was slightly different, but for module A, B, and then the common module, I would aim for at least 1,000 words for sort of my base essays that I would use, given that I usually would adapt them quite a bit during the exam. So I would never do my essays word for word. So I'd add maybe about 200 more words, just sort of tweaking it and making sure that it really answered the question. And then module C, I found that it really worked well to sort of prepare to do less words for that, because I think that the markers often don't expect as many words for module C. So maybe I'd have a base of about 600, 700, and then add another couple hundred during the exam. And that worked really well because during my actual HSE, I only had to spend about 30 minutes on module C. So I could do quite a bit more on module A and B, which worked really well. So that was my general length of the essays. And I would just say that obviously it is quality over quantity, but I think that to sort of improve my marks, something that really helped was trying to honestly just write as much as I could. And it definitely was hard because I do not have the best handwriting at all. And so after trials, my English and history teachers were like, Rosie, we can't even read your essays. So that was something I had to work on. But yeah, I would definitely say just try to almost be writing the entirety of the exam. I mean, obviously at the start, you really want to think about how you answer the question and what your thesis will be and any changes you have to make. But yeah.
How did you think about timing though? Because, it's one thing to say write as much as you can, but then so many students come out of that exam having not finished all of the sections, so they didn't actually plan accordingly. So how did you get that balance right? Did you know roughly what you could produce in, say, 40 minutes time?
Yeah, definitely. I think just doing assessments throughout the year and lots of practice, by the time that I got to the HSC, I just could know sort of roughly what was done in 40 minutes. Yeah, so I would definitely say that came down to practice. And when I would do assessments throughout the year, they'd give us 40 minutes. And so I'd practice and see how many words I could write. So by the time it got to the trials and the HSC, I had a rough estimate of how many words I could produce and what that felt like when I was actually handwriting it.
And in terms of those draft essays and then what you were doing, in those days of practice questions and revisions, how did you go about that? So did you have one core draft essay that you would essentially memorize, or maybe you just knew it really well, you had backup quotes, and then you would look at new questions and work through it? Like, what was your process start to finish in terms of drafting? Students always ask, how many drafts do I need per module? So what was your approach there, and what's your advice for students struggling with that?
Yeah, so the common module, so the first module, I think I had about 6 points that I could use. So within each point, I would have sort of a key idea. So say, for example, guilt. And then within each paragraph, I'd make sure to have at least 1 to 2 sort of unique structural or dramatic features that I could talk about. And then I'd usually contrast 2 characters. And as well, on top of that, I'd make sure to have a couple key links to the rubric. And so that meant that whatever essay question I got, I could sort of adapt these paragraphs to fit the question. So if it asked specifically about how Arthur Miller used character, each paragraph usually contrasted 2 characters. Or if the question was about the dramatic form, each paragraph had those structural features that I talked about. So I would just sort of tweak how I sort of structured each paragraph and what I focused on and what I linked more closely to my thesis and my point sentences. So for the first 2 paragraphs in a common module essay, that's what I would do. I would pick whatever 2 paragraphs kind of worked best and tweak them accordingly. And then for the third point, I would always try to have a counter. And that would be focusing on John Proctor and sort of his transformation and how at the end he's sort of the tragic hero. And I found that doing practice questions about 80% of the time, it would work to have that as a counterpoint. And I think it helped to strengthen my essays because it often would show the other side. So I would usually have 2 paragraphs that talked about the dark nature of humans and how everyone's falling into hysteria and fear. And then I'd sort of always counter that with John Proctor and sort of what he does at the end and how he shows integrity. And one more thing I would say about common module that I learned was that it's really helpful to focus on more macro dramatic features rather than more common sort of literary techniques like similes and metaphors. I think when I was first writing those common module essays, I would just be talking about, juxtaposition and metaphors and similes, which are really good and you still should, I think, include in each of your paragraphs. But I think my essays improved when I started talking more about the 4-act structure and authorial intrusion and all those sort of more macro things that linked really well to Arthur Miller's context as well. So yeah, that was common module. For module A, I did a 4-paragraph structure. So I did Tempest and Hagseed. So I would go Tempest, Hagseed, Tempest, Hagseed. So sort of like 2 comparisons there. And for that module, I had about 4 or 5 key concepts that I had really worked on and that I could sort of adapt to whatever the question was. So things sort of like imprisonment or the other. And to develop those, I would say my biggest tip is just reading lots of journal articles to really sort of elevate your arguments and find good vocabulary. That's what I did to sort of develop those ideas and sort of make them unique. And I would say my biggest tip for Module A is to always counter. You always should, I think, try to counter both the question and your own response. So if the question is something simple like, how does context influence a text? I think it's kind of like, yes, of course, context does influence the text, but instead of just giving 2 comparative examples, maybe give 1 example and then do your second point and counter it. So talk about how maybe composers often innovate and they subvert their context. I think that definitely helped improve my essays. So for Module A, I was always looking for ways to sort of counter the question and disagree with it and sort of argue against it where it could work. That was Module A. Module B, I did T.S. Eliot, and that was probably the module that I was least confident in since we did it last. But I would just say, I think it's important to have just a general understanding of each of the 5 poems. And I think out of all the modules, it's probably the one where you can use the same sort of evidence to argue different things or talk about different ideas. So knowing your 5 poems and maybe having 3, 4 solid evidence or like techniques to talk about is helpful. And for Module B, that was the one where I went in with a pre-planned essay. So I did a 3-body paragraph structure. And I chose that over 2-body paragraphs just because when I had practiced with 2-body paragraphs, I found that it could often be mistaken as incomplete. Or like when I got friends to read it, they often just thought that I didn't get time to do a 3rd paragraph. So I thought it was just safest to go with 3 paragraphs. And so I would do preludes and Rhapsody, then Rhapsody and Hollow Men, and then Hollow Men and Rhapsody. And for each paragraph, I'd have sort of a unique thesis. So I actually used what Jettle recommended because I used to watch a lot of Jettle videos and see what other student tips were. And I found that the first paragraph, I would talk about the landscape, so urban decay. And then I sort of had a logical progression. So the second paragraph was about how it sort of assimilates with the persona's souls in his poems. And then the third one was about how like spirituality or rebirth was like futile in the end. And within each paragraph, I made sure to have sort of one underlying structural feature. So for the first one, I did immersive metaphysical settings. The second one, I did how he uses sort of anonymous personas that can be sort of embodied by any reader. And then the third one, I talked about his intertextual references and how he draws on different philosophers and texts. And so that actually worked in my favor really well in the HSC because the question, if I recall, it asked about like artistry and integrity, which sort of lent towards structure and form. And so I could sort of, in each paragraph, I could use that sort of base essay, which had my own thesis and my own sort of point sentences and just really focus in on those underlying structural features. And then finally, for Module C, my approach to Module C was always to never just pre-plan word for word, go in with essays and discursives to write or imaginative texts. I would always, whenever I did practice, just try to think on the spot and really answer the question and really try to think of what the markers were looking for. So for the actual HSE, I remember I had throughout the year just little snippets of characters or settings that I have developed, maybe 100 to 200 words that in any situation I could just sort of pull out so I wouldn't be ever sort of just stuck on the spot with something that I didn't know. And I had one sort of discursive, imaginative concept that I was just hoping would fit with the question. And it was a metatextual, is metatextual the right word? Metatextual piece. Yeah. Sorry, it's been a while now, but
it's all in the past.
Yeah, it's all in the past. I had a metatextual piece. It was framed within a narrative. So it was a discursive piece that could be made into an imaginative. So it was about a woman who had lost her father and she was trying to write his eulogy. And as she's struggling to type it out on her computer, she reads a lot of her father's sort of books and notes, and she realizes the power of the handwritten form. So it was a discursive that basically discussed the art of the handwritten form versus technology and how, we should bring back, pen and paper, that sort of thing. And then in the end, she sort of, my examples, I use like anecdotes and like little stories of her and her father. And then by the end, she actually closes her laptop and she begins to write the eulogy by hand. So it's sort of like symbolic in that way. And I think doing a sort of meta sort of story was really helpful because it allowed me to actually really tangibly sort of speak about the power of words and in quite a poetic way, I think, which I really enjoyed. And something that else else that I did as well that I sort of just decided last minute was I actually used the lining on my page in the actual exam. So when I was talking about how we see so much through someone's handwriting, I actually like fragmented my words across the page in a certain way and did little things like that just to sort of create interest, which was, looking back, probably a bit risky, but I had a bit of fun with that. And I was really fortunate that the question worked in my favor, so I could use that general idea that I really wanted to use.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. That was very comprehensive, but super practical, which I love. And, hearing a lot of the sentiments that we try to push on the JETL channel as well. So great to hear that those are all applied. But yeah, super smart the way you approached it. Module C, just working backwards there. I mean, doing a kind of meta-fictional, meta-textual approach, that allows you to be super adaptable to different stimuli. So for students watching, if you write about the process of writing, that's the best way to adapt to any question about the craft itself. And a lot of the prescribed text and the unit in general is pretty much targeting that. So when you're thinking about what to write about, try and write about something connected to writing or art. It doesn't have to be writing specifically, but some kind of creative process. I've seen a lot of students, in your position, Rosie, done super well, gotten a state rank. They often have written about some kind of craft, some kind of art form. And I think the way you experimented with form, because I always say experimental form is a really good way to stand out, that was clever as well. I know you said risky, but think about it from a marker's perspective. If they're reading your piece and suddenly the structure on the page is a bit different, and that's actually matching what you're talking about, so the form reflects the substance, that's a really smart and efficient kind of thing to do, because it allows you to convey what you're saying in less words because you're just showing it on the page. And it's innovative, right? So markers are going to be interested. Were there any other kind of tactics that you were conscious of with Module C? Because people always ask, what's the best way to approach a discursive or persuasive, or how do I know what to write about? Anything else that you would add to those kind of two key pillars?
Yeah, so another sort of tip that I would say is that if you want to pre-plan an imaginative or a discursive, to try to link it to a text that already exists, maybe that you're really interested in, because I think it gives more depth to your response. And if there is a reflection, it always gives you something extra to reflect on that I think the marker would appreciate. So an imaginative concept that I had that I could potentially use, I actually wrote in Extension 1, and it was based on Chinua Achebe's African trilogy. And again, it was sort of meta because it was about how this tribe in Nigeria that he actually wrote about would use sort of music and other sort of customs and rituals as their way of storytelling. And that was sort of their craft of writing in a way. So yeah, that's another thing I would say.
So just leaning into that, was like intertextuality a big part of it? Like, did you make actual references to other texts in your piece?
Yeah, so that imaginative that I used in Extension 1 that I could have used in craft of writing, my teacher actually encouraged me to use some of the language that Achebe used and some of the native language of the tribe in that, which I definitely tried to do. And I tried to make quite explicit intertextual references that would be clear to the marker that I was drawing on another piece of literature to sort of craft my own.
Yeah, I think that's great because those kind of things just help set you apart. They're just kind of not an easy thing necessarily to do, but something everyone can do just to help elevate the quality and the kind of academic appeal of your work. So if you want to stand out, you should be trying to employ these very kind of, call them tactics or strategies, but they're great things to actually try and incorporate. So that's Module C. Any other advice generally about how to approach different stimuli? Like, how are you prepared for all of the different text types, like discursive, persuasive, imaginative? What was kind of the most efficient way to prepare for all of the possibilities when it comes to different stimuli and different forms of writing?
Yeah, I definitely think the fact that you go into an exam and you don't know what you're going to get is just the most daunting thing. So I remember that was quite stressful. But I guess my process for formulating these essays and preparing for questions is that throughout the term, I would always start with just my base notes. So that would just include everything we sort of talked about in class and just those initial readings that I would do. And then I would build on that with the JETL notes and resources which our school had, which was super helpful because it sort of took my base notes sort of to a more deeper level and gave me really great techniques and concepts to talk about and helped me sort of organize my thoughts and think about how I may structure them. And then the next step was to read lots of journal articles, like lots of them. That's probably one of the biggest tips I can give. It really helps you get much better vocabulary and really elevate your ideas. And I think that if you want to sort of create unique and original theses and ideas, which I think is a really important part of each module, I think journal articles is one of the biggest ways to do that. And also just reading tons of stuff online and always reading your classmates and friends' work as well to sort of help your own ideas. And then I think throughout the year, I'd produce a few base essays or base paragraphs for each module that I had in my pocket. And I would usually memorize them mostly word for word, but almost always adapt them quite a lot to really answer the question, which is something that I struggled with throughout the year with assessments that my teachers really helped me with. They really encouraged me to not just write an essay word for word as I had memorized, but to really just think about the question and answer it in a unique and original way. And then I think right before the HSE, or maybe it was right before the trial exams, I just made documents and put like 30 practice questions on them for each module, like as many as I could find and the hardest ones that I could find. And I would kind of just speed through it, spend 5 minutes on each, and just make sure that I could answer them and that I could produce 2 or 3 points for them. And I'd dot point what quotes I would use or how I would actually adapt my base essays. So that was really helpful to prepare for sort of any given scenario in the exam.
Yeah, I love that. So one thing that's definitely standing out to me is this, reliance, I shouldn't say reliance, but the kind of initiative you took to look at journals and the academic articles and all the information that's out there online that a lot of people aren't aware of, or that a lot of people just don't bother to look at. For people who are wondering, what's a journal? What do you mean by reading a journal? Can you take us through what that actually looked like for you in terms of what you searched online? Did you go to Google? Then what would you look at? Then what did you do with the information you found, and how did that translate into your essay? Because everything you're saying there resonates a lot with how I approached my essays when I did it. It was a ton of research because I thought that's the best way to get ahead and stand out. And I'm going to be looking at all of these, high-level materials that probably no one else is looking at, and using this more advanced vocabulary and these better and deeper concepts. But what does that process actually look like? How can someone now research online, use journal articles, and side note, JETL tries to incorporate those in a lot of the resources, but how does someone actually do that and incorporate it into their essay, and what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so the way that I would access all of these journal articles is through the State Library website, which I think anyone can create an account for free. And it was super, super useful for all of my English modules. I would just basically search up the text or the author and then maybe some keywords. And you can find so many articles from all different websites and authors. And a lot of them would end up just being irrelevant. So you kind of have to do a lot of searching and skim through a lot to find the good ones. But when you do find a good article, it's just so incredibly helpful. And something that I really aimed to do was develop as much as I could unique sort of ideas or takes on particular concepts in my texts to try to help them to stand out to a marker more. And so something that I would do is read these journal articles, which a lot of them I couldn't even understand. They were very complex, but I would slowly sort of try to link together lots of different ideas in lots of different articles to sort of form my own thesis. So yeah, that's kind of what I did, and I couldn't recommend it enough. It was super, super helpful.
So for people listening, they can just go onto State Library website, or can go onto Google Scholar is another one, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, just type in something like The Crucible or your text name followed by the word analysis, commentary, something like intertextuality if you're doing module A, and then you're looking for different articles that have been written by academics, people who do this as a profession, and you're skimming through the articles. A lot of it you won't understand, but some concepts will stand out, and then are you just taking notes from that and then trying to work that into different parts of your essay? How is that going straight into your drafts, in the sense that you see a great kind of concept and then you try and work it in? Did you have a kind of big document of notes from different articles? What did that last part look like?
Yeah, so pretty much for each module, I just have a really long document where I just copy and paste big chunks out of journal articles that I liked and just put them into like these big long documents. And then later I just scroll through and reread the things that I had pulled out of those articles and maybe just highlight or comment on things that stood out to me more. And sometimes I'd implement phrases specifically and like quote the actual author of the journal article. I think particularly for extension 1 more so. But I think just that whole process of finding these ideas and then sort of using them to inspire your own theses and ideas, it just helps you sort of just subconsciously sort of pick up all this really great vocabulary and ways of thinking about a text that you sort of wouldn't really get in class or just online. So it's definitely a long and quite a tedious thing to do. But yeah, just that long process of copying and rereading, and sometimes I'd even copy and paste big chunks into ChatGPT and just say, please explain this simply, because I wouldn't really understand it. So that was also really helpful.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up ChatGPT. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I just think such a great point here that I just want to hammer in. For anyone who wants to get high 90s in English, one of the most common behaviors of students who actually get, say, 95 or above in English, whether it's English Advanced, Standard, Extension, is doing this extra research. And, you know, as Rosie, as you're saying, it is a tedious process, and it might only help with that extra few percent or those extra 3 or 4 marks, but that is going to make the difference for a lot of students when it comes to getting a high 90s or a low 90s. It's, do you have that extra, you know, academic rigor? Do you have that extra academic language that is going to set you apart? So strongly advise anyone listening to this to use that strategy throughout your kind of essay drafting process, so that you have that better vocabulary and those high level concepts in there. Even if it's the same concept, but you're just saying it in a different way to everyone else based on the specific language that's being used in the classroom or somewhere online. But ChatGPT, AI, every year now is going to be more and more attuned to AI, but so far you're the freshest coming out of a full year where AI and ChatGPT and other AI platforms have been around. So how did that feature? You mentioned one use case there where you would have an article that you were reading, then you'd get ChatGPT to summarize it or simplify it for your understanding. How else did you use it, if at all, for your preparation?
Yeah, it was actually so useful, especially by the time I got to the HSE. I think I was probably a bit hesitant throughout the year to use it, but I used it for so many different things. I would never actually get it to write an essay or sort of even edit my own work, but to help me sort of link together concepts or explain my own thoughts, I found it really useful because when I was really sort of meticulously trying to formulate a final thesis or a final point that I did want to include in a potential essay for the HSE, I would often find that my thoughts were a bit jumbled and I had these different ideas, but I sort of saw a vague link, but I just couldn't articulate it. So I just chuck it into ChatGPT, and it would always help to sort of just simplify and articulate my thoughts when I couldn't. And then I could take that and then actually write what I wanted to and create my own sort of points and ideas.
Yeah, awesome. So I think that should be pretty helpful for people going forward. And, you know, importantly, as you said, you're not getting it to kind of write for you, because what you'll find, at least when I've used and continue to use it, I'm always testing. Jettel's doing a lot with AI in terms of helping give feedback and mark essays and provide suggested edits, etc. But what I found is if you get it to try and write an essay in full for you, the quality is just not there, especially in terms of what teachers and markers expect at an HSE level, or just at a school level in general in New South Wales. Like, the language is quite robotic. So I'm sure that will improve over time. And that's not to say, you know, use it more and more for that, but just be very wary in how you use AI. But I think it definitely does serve a purpose. Just to add another note in on that, I found when going through different units with students that when students are lacking a lot of context and form, like you were talking a lot about macro features and how important they are in their essays, jump onto ChatGPT just like you would on Google, and you can do the same on Google. ChatGPT is just faster now and more kind of precise in terms of what you're looking for. And just type in like, what are 5 to 10 specific elements of form and context for this text? And then you can verify that on Google, because 10-20% of the time there's going to be a slight error there, but at least get a nice list of things that you can then incorporate into your essay to make sure you're adding more context, more form, more of those macro features. So that's just another use case for AI. But back to general essay writing. I feel like we've almost covered the whole paper, which is awesome. Anything else on the essay writing front? I was interested in just asking about the structures again, because you mentioned with Elliot, say you were doing 3 body paragraphs, and a lot of people do 3 body paragraphs. I always recommend that as a base, unless you're super slow writer, then you've got to do 2. But what about with the common module? Were you always doing 3 body paragraphs there? And how did you structure those body paragraphs? Did you have a topic sentence followed by 3 to 4 sentences of analysis, then a link? Where did you first bring in context? Were there any other little tricks or tips that you have for how to improve the sophistication of those parts of the essay?
Yeah, so for the common module, it was pretty much always that 3-paragraph structure with usually the counterpoint at the end. And with all my modules, I think I experimented with doing 2 paragraphs or maybe 4. And I always found that 3 worked the best except for module A. And for common module, to actually structure the paragraphs, I would always start with a beyond text point sentence. I think that's something that I found was really important to do. Never just jumping in text specific. So being like, in the crucible, Arthur Miller does this. Just always having quite a conceptual point.
So for everyone listening, a conceptual topic sentence, can you give us like just a rough example of what that looks like? How can it not be connected to the text? What does that look like, and when do you bring in the text?
Yeah, so a conceptual or like beyond text topic sentence, it doesn't mention the text at all. It's more broad. It's more just like a general sort of statement. So for example, my topic sentence for my paragraph on guilt was that guilt consumes those who remain passive in their guilt, but it purifies those who transform their guilt into social responsibility. So something general like that. I tried to make them quite nuanced without them being too convoluted, which is always a tricky task. But yeah, sort of just introducing that idea.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that example is a really good one, because you're obviously talking about the text, you're extrapolating, you're taking the idea out of the text, but you're not actually saying the text or the author's name, because you're making a more general point that is going to be supported by the text, which is, again, another kind of high level or advanced strategy. The other thing that was good about the example you just provided is it had the nuance, because people often talk about nuance, in the sense that it actually demonstrated a complexity in the topic, because a lot of people will hear you say, oh, my first paragraph's about guilt. I don't think they would have assumed that it was that specific about guilt, because a lot of people just say, oh, it's about guilt. But you actually said guilt can do this, but it can also do this for those that take on a social responsibility. So there was a lot of complexity built in to the topic sentences there. Was that something you were also conscious of?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that I really worked to refine throughout the year, and was something that I definitely think improved my essays towards the end of the year. So something that I was really trying to be conscious of, and something that I actually did use ChatGPT for. I would often put in some ideas that I had and say, how can I make this more nuanced and more sophisticated?
So after the topic sentence, what would come after that?
I didn't really have a rigid structure, but usually it would be actually 2 topic sentences. So I'd have sort of my more broad one, and then I'd maybe sort of specify it related to the text. So I'd have my sentence on guilt, and then maybe expand on that even more, but relate it to Arthur Miller and the Crucible. And then usually after that, I'd have a context sentence specific to whatever paragraph I was using. And something that I did that I found super helpful for the HSE and for all of my modules is I had a list of what I would call context sentences. So they would basically be maybe 6 or 7 specific sentences that I had worked to refine, that I had memorized as well, that I could sort of just insert in these paragraphs and adapt where needed. I think because context is something that's super important, and that I found my teachers were always emphasizing, having like pre-memorized sort of sophisticated sentences that linked to various different parts of Arthur Miller's context or whatever author I was using was super helpful. So after that, I would use one of those sentences, one or two, and then maybe expand on it and adapt it. And then for the common module, the way that I like to think about my paragraphs is that you start macro and then you sort of zoom in a bit. So I would start with those broader structural features that linked well, that flowed well after I would talk about context. So maybe it was something about the 4-act structure or the use of props and stage directions. I would maybe talk about 1 to 2 of those and give examples. And then I would maybe zoom in a bit more and be specific and maybe talk about a simile or a metaphor as well. And then after that, I'd maybe have another context sentence, potentially link it to context in another way. And then I'd finish with a 1-sentence link sentence.
Very nice. Well, that's super helpful. So again, appreciate you being so practical because people listening have these takeaways. And one caveat, of course, to this is for students who are slower writers, be really careful just applying this exactly because maybe you actually will have to forfeit a couple of those early sentences. Like you might have one topic sentence and then you might need to go straight into your analysis versus having double topic sentence and context because you might run out of time if you try to incorporate all of that on the day and adapt to a question. Anything else that you want to add on the essay section before we get to that final section 1, just to discuss how you approach that?
I think that's kind of everything for essays. The thing I would say is that it's always super helpful to go in with base essays and base paragraphs, especially by the time of the HSC when it is super nerve-wracking, not knowing what they're going to throw at you. But I will say that you've always got to be prepared to adapt heaps because I think honestly, it's not even an advantage to go in with those pre-memorized ideas because I think a lot of students in the state are going to have A-level pre-memorized essays, but it's about how you adapt them to the question and always, I will say, always look where you can to disagree and counter the question and counter your own argument as well.
Really good advice. So section 1, last one, you got 18 out of 20 in the final one, which is still a great mark, but we were making the point that you basically got full marks and everything else. Was section 1 more challenging for you in terms of the lead up, or was that just how it landed on the day? Could have got 20 out of 20 in that, 19 somewhere else. How did you approach section 1 and how did you feel about it? Because personally, I used to find that was the hardest one because that was the most uncertain. Whereas with those essays, you can have a lot of the base materials and you can practice adapting. Section 1, you're confronted with all these new texts. It's a lot of time pressure. So yeah, what was your feeling towards it and what was your strategy?
I think it wasn't necessarily the section I found the hardest, but the section that I gave the least thought to. I guess since you do reading comprehension from quite an early sort of year in school, I sort of just did a bit of practice. I did quite a few HSC exams and trial papers, and then I found it really super helpful to read a lot of sample answers. And as well, I think reading tasks are something that is super easy to sort of swap with a friend and get them to give you feedback with as well. I think honestly, what I found the hardest about the reading section is just understanding a text, which I never really thought would be the hardest part until I came to the HSC. Because I think my strategy for the reading task all throughout year 12 and just school in general was to sort of just cherry pick the ideas and the techniques that would work well within a short paragraph or work well for whatever I wanted to say, until I realized maybe around the trials time that I actually had to go in and have the attitude that I've got to actually try to understand the general idea of the text, because the markers are looking for you to give a clear sort of what statement that answers the question and shows that you actually know what the text is about. So I think looking back on the actual HSC, maybe one of the later texts, I just sort of missed the mark on what it was actually trying to convey. Yeah, I think maybe that's probably where I sort of went wrong. And it's a hard thing to do as well, because you just never know what you're going to get. And I think as well, it's the first exam. I was super nervous, and I'm sure like everyone else was super nervous as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and again, just to reinforce, 18 is still an outstanding mark. So it's not to say we're looking for, what went wrong here, but more just a case of, how do you approach it, because it is a different section to the other one. So 18 out of 20 is still a great mark. And you can never rely on 20 out of 20 for any section, because there's always an element of subjectivity. If anything, section 1 would be the most objective because you're dealing with fewer marks per question, and if you satisfy the elements that are required, you can typically get all the marks, but very hard to anticipate what exactly you're going to be examined on. So for you, you were saying that read in, sample responses, doing practice questions. Is that essentially the key there?
Yeah, I think practice is honestly one of the things that you can do for the reading task. But I will say as well, I think something that's really helpful, especially if maybe English is not your favorite subject, is to sort of take a very formulaic approach. And I think the JETL videos and resources are super helpful for this. I watched pretty much all of them, but the basic sort of the basic sort of rule is that the amount of examples you give is the amount of marks minus 1. So if it's a 3-mark question, you give 2 examples. So for all of my reading task questions, I generally start with a 1-sentence or 2-sentence what, like beyond text or conceptual statement that answered the question and sort of just showed that I understood what the text was about and how it answered the question. And then I give those pieces of evidence. And for each piece of evidence, I gave the technique, an example, and then expanded on my what statement in sort of try to expand on it in a new and different way as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I think very sound advice for all to follow. Make sure you check out the JETL videos as well. And Rosie, really appreciate you offering all that advice. Any final general advice for students going through the HSC now or soon to be going through the HSC?
Yeah, I think I definitely say to just try and enjoy Year 12 as much as you can. I had an amazing Year 12 experience, I think, because I had so many great teachers and wonderful friends, and I was so blessed in that way. So yeah, it is definitely difficult and it's definitely a challenge, the HSC, but it's also a lot of fun, honestly. And Year 12, your final year of school, take it all in, hang out where you can with your friends and with your family. And I think for me as well, it was really important to stay connected in church, and for me, being a Christian, sort of having my eyes fixed on something so much bigger and greater than the HSC really helped me, and helped me to sort of stay motivated throughout it all. So yeah, that's what I would say to everyone.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Rosie, and thanks everyone for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.